Have you ever wondered what happens when the kindest person you know simply stops? Not out of physical exhaustion, not out of resentment, but because they've reached the point where trying no longer makes sense. This question is more dangerous than it seems, because it opens a dark door, the place where the soul, after so much renunciation, begins to scream without a voice. And this scream, finding no echo, becomes absence. An absence that weighs more heavily than any constant presence. An absence that isn't immediately noticeable, but that, once established, transforms the entire atmosphere. The empath's silence is like a sudden wind that blows out candles. No one sees where it came from, but everyone feels it when the light fades. Carl Jung said that everything we repress doesn't disappear, it just hides. But what's hidden doesn't lose strength, it only gains depth. And when it returns with accumulated power. The empath, this being who lives to alleviate the pain of others, also carries a silent fury. A fury that doesn't explode, that doesn't make noise. But this transforms into something much more frightening: disappearance. It's the retaliation of the soul that was ignored. A disappearance that to others seems like indifference, but which deep down is a desperate cry for oneself. He disappears from gestures, from attention, from presence. He stops responding with urgency. He stops smiling automatically. He stops offering his body as a temple for pains that were never his. And it's not because he's stopped loving. It's because he's been forced to abandon himself for so long that loving others has become a sacrifice of his own existence. When surrender is constant and unilateral, it becomes a disguised form of self-denial. And the soul, no matter how compassionate, one day collapses. And in this silent collapse, something awakens. Something that was buried beneath layers of goodwill and emotional obedience. Jung called this the return of the repressed. That part of the self that was hidden, silenced, educated never to disturb. But there is a limit. There always is. And when that limit is crossed, the mask falls. Not dramatically, not in an emotional outburst. It simply can't hold up anymore. The weight of internal inconsistency causes it to crumble. And in that crumbling, a new structure emerges. Still fragile but truer. Still shaky but radically honest. The empath begins to wonder, what if my value isn't in being useful? What if my existence doesn't need to be justified by how much comfort I generate for others? The empath spends years molding himself. He learns to smile while dying inside. He learns to listen when he only wants to be heard. He learns to welcome without ever being welcomed. He plays the role of the strong, the balanced, the one who never needs help. But behind this performance, there's a desert, a void that grows silently, fueled by the illusion that being useful is the same as being loved. And this void, even when disguised by kindness and quick solutions, erodes the very fabric of the being. Every okay said with teary eyes, every sure you can count on me that stifles a cry for help, silently kills something. He's the one you call at 3 a.m., but who never receives a spontaneous call. The one who knows how to listen to your tragedies without interrupting, but who has no one to tell his own. He's the shoulder, the shelter, the anchor. But when he sinks, no one notices. No one dives to save him, and he learns to sink in silence. He learns to stifle his own tears so as not to disturb the noise of others' pain. He learns to be his own lifeline, while continuing to offer buoyancy to everyone around him. But there is a moment, a precise instant, when he looks around and understands, no one comes, no one returns, no one asks, and then he stops, not feeling, but giving. He understands that his unlimited giving has become an emotional prison. And the key is within him, a key that no longer opens other people's doors, but locks his own, not as an escape, but as a form of healing. This is the beginning of your transformation, a transformation invisible to those who have never seen your pain, but brutally real to those who experience it internally. It's the first spark of your own fire, the first guilt-free breath, the first no said without a tremor in your voice. There's no warning, there's no drama. There's a weariness that goes unnamed, a disappointment that doesn't explode. It just settles deep in the chest like a slowly growing rock. And when this weight becomes unbearable, the empath does something more frightening than any scream. They retreat. And in that retreat, you find space. A space they've never been allowed to occupy. A space that, when inhabited, begins to reveal an inner landscape they've never known, their own will. Carl Jung said that the shadow is composed of everything the individual refuses to acknowledge as part of themselves. The empath, throughout life, pushed this shadow away. Everything that seemed selfish, he discarded. Everything that smacked of limits, he considered sinful. Everything that involved saying no, he nullified. He believed that being good meant never imposing boundaries. But he forgot that even the purest love needs boundaries. Even the most generous river needs banks to avoid becoming a flood. But the shadow will not accept being ignored forever. And it returns, not to destroy, but to protect, to restore the integrity of a soul that has been broken 1,000 times in the name of a love that was never reciprocated. The shadow, far from being an enemy, is the guardian of the parts you sacrifice to be accepted. It is the survival instinct reconfigured as maturity. This return is the most dangerous moment in the empath's journey, because it's at this point that they stop being predictable. They stop being available. They stop being the one who always says yes. And the world, accustomed to draining their energy without asking permission, panics, because what was once guaranteed has now become silence. What was once easy now demands mutual presence. What was once habitual has become absence. But the empath doesn't respond with revenge. He doesn't seek punishment. He simply stops. He stops carrying. He stops saving. He stops justifying himself. And this silence becomes a language. A new language strange to those who have always benefited from the noise of their compulsive giving. A language that doesn't need to be understood by others. It just needs to be respected. And this, for someone who has always lived off their generosity, feels like betrayal. But it's not betrayal, it's rebirth. It's the point at which the empath is born as a subject and ceases to be an emotional resource for others. It's when the flame that warmed everyone finally begins to warm itself. Jung asserted that the process of individuation, the path to becoming who one truly is, requires confronting the shadow. It demands delving into what has been denied. The empath in this delve rediscovers all the parts they abandoned in order to be accepted. The right to silence, the right to limits, the right to choose, the right to exist beyond the usefulness they offer. And they also discover a new definition of love, one that does not demand self-sacrifice. And for the first time, he chooses himself. This isn't selfishness. It's emotional maturity. It's knowing that loving another can never mean disappearing from yourself. That service is only noble when it doesn't require self-annihilation. That helping another isn't synonymous with carrying the entire world on your shoulders. That offering presence doesn't mean accepting being drained. That being available isn't a life sentence. Society venerates the sacrificial empath, the one who gives until he bleeds, who listens until he's exhausted, who cares until he forgets he needs care too. But the dangerous empath, what Jung would call the integrated self, doesn't give out of necessity. He gives out of conscience. He knows that giving without choice isn't love, it's compulsion, and that non-compulsive love is revolution. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything because now he doesn't rush to respond to messages. He breathes, he evaluates, he decides if he wants to, if he can, if he has the energy. He no longer rushes to fix others. He observes. And he understands that not all pain needs to be carried by him. Not all chaos is his responsibility. Not every request is a call. Not every "I need you" is love. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes it's dependence. Sometimes it's just a reflex of someone who never learned to support themselves. The integrated empath is not indifferent. They are selective. They have learned that love without reciprocity is consumption, that limitless help is self-destruction, that empathy without awareness is the shortest path to burnout. And that's scary. It scares those who have grown accustomed to the door always being open, to the heart always being available, to the ear always being attentive. Now, there's a filter, a criterion, a conscience. A choice where before there was only obligation disguised as affection. Now, there's a lucid presence. Jung reminded us that the soul becomes ill when forced to live against its own truth. And the empath, by forcing himself to be everything to everyone, slowly becomes ill. He becomes ill from listening, from waiting, from the absence of return. He becomes ill from emptiness. But his healing begins the moment he says enough, not out loud, but in the subtle language of someone who will no longer be absent from themselves to please others. In silent refusal, in deliberate delay, in the silence that says more than any justification, in the withdrawal that needs no explanation. This enough isn't the end, it's the beginning. It's the starting point of a new existence, one in which he still loves, still feels, still cares. But from now on, he loves with limits. He feels with discernment. He cares with balance. He lives with awareness. And he responds only to that which resonates with his integrity, with his truth, with his will. And when the world realizes that the one who always saved has now saved himself first, everything changes. The scales shift. Relationships reveal themselves. And the empath discovers which connections were real and which were merely disguised forms of emotional exploitation, who loved him and who merely used him. Because the empath who has woken up does not go back to sleep. The question now is, what happens when the light that illuminated everyone decides to turn inward? This is where the real danger begins. The danger of consciousness, of clarity, of choice. The danger of someone who has finally discovered that the most urgent love is the one they owe to themselves, that their first loyalty must be to their soul, and the world which fed on your automatic giving will discover that your absence weighs more heavily than your constant presence, because your presence is no longer a favor. It is a gift, rare, sacred, limited, and above all, chosen. In the next part, we'll traverse the silence that sets in when the empath stops responding to others' calls. We'll explore what emerges when they look, for the first time, at their own pain, not as a victim, but as a lucid witness to their own soul. And in that gaze, something reveals itself, the truth that was always there, waiting to be chosen. Are you ready to see what happens? When the one who has always listened finally decides to speak up, there's a kind of silence that doesn't arise from calm, but from exhaustion. It's not the peace that comes after a resolution. It's the emptiness that appears when you realize that no matter how hard you've tried, nothing has changed. This silence isn't neutral. It speaks. It screams. It weighs more heavily than any scream ever uttered, because it carries no hope. It arises when the one who's been a refuge for a lifetime finally understands that no one will come back for them. And not because they've forgotten, but because they never thought they might need it to. The world asks you to listen, understand, forgive. But it never asks if you still have the energy for it. It awaits your presence, your empathy, your patience. But it fails to notice that over time, all of this has been depleted without being replenished. The empath has become a source for others, and a desert for themselves. And there's something brutally poetic about this. People hydrate themselves with the waters you carry, while you walk dry inside. It's in this scenario that something begins to change, slowly, without warning. A withdrawal that's unplanned but inevitable. The empath begins to realize they're always available for problems that aren't their own. That they're always involved in other people's crises while their own are ignored. They begin to wonder why they're the only one who comes back, the only one who insists, the only one who lets things go. And with these questions, something inside them breaks. Carl Jung said that what doesn't reach consciousness returns as destiny. The empath, by denying their own pain, constantly repeats patterns of abandonment, thinking they're helping, when in reality they're just reliving their own trauma of not being seen. Blind empathy becomes a form of survival, an unconscious pact that says, if I'm good enough, maybe someone will choose me. But that moment never comes, and the soul, tired of waiting, begins to protect itself. Protection doesn't come as rigid armor. It comes as absence, like not responding immediately, like refusing that phone call you would have answered on the first ring. It comes as that deliberate silence after yet another repetitive rant, The empath begins to create distance, and these distances aren't revenge, they're defense. They're the first manifestation of a self-love that was buried under tons of emotional obligation. Leticia, 29, a psychologist, has always been the sensible, welcoming, and available friend. Since adolescence, she was the one her classmates sought out when they broke up with a boyfriend, fought with their parents, or didn't know what to do with their lives. She listened, always listened, even when she was tired, even when she had important exams, family crises, or financial problems. Other people's emotional lives took up more space in her schedule than her own. Until one day, upon receiving the 10th message in a row from a friend telling her about the same abusive relationship Leticia had been warning about for years, she felt something different. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pity, it was emptiness, an inner silence. And for the first time, she didn't respond. She deleted the notification and continued her night. She was startled by this new reaction. She thought she had become insensitive. But upon reflection, she understood that what had died there wasn't empathy. It was emotional dependence disguised as care. She realized she had created a network of relationships where she was irreplaceable, but she was never chosen to share a spontaneous joy, for a weightless invitation, for something that didn't involve a crisis. Leticia was functional, and that consumed her. Little by little, she began to say no. First, guiltily, then, firmly. She began to wonder if she wanted to hear another tragic story at 2 a.m, or if she wanted to sleep peacefully. She began to realize that love isn't about carrying the other person in your arms all the time. It's about walking alongside them and allowing them to carry you too. When that doesn't happen, it's not love. It's emotional exploitation with a fancy name. The dangerous empath, as Jung would suggest, is one who begins to withdraw their energy from places where it was consumed without return. They don't cease to be empathetic, but they develop discernment. They learn to listen without absorbing, to care without exhausting themselves, to be present without disappearing from themselves. And this changes the entire dynamic around them. When you start prioritizing your peace, the reactions are unexpected. People who used to benefit from your constant presence start calling you selfish. They say you've changed, that you've distanced yourself, that you're not the same anymore. And they're right, you're not the same anymore. Because now you're seeing yourself, you're listening to yourself, you're choosing yourself. And this is intolerable for those who have become accustomed to being a priority in your life, while you were merely a supporting character in your own story. The empath's silence begins to bother, because he's no longer the one who sets the tone in conversations, who holds the emotional threads of family gatherings, who smooths over disagreements in a group of friends, who translates poorly expressed feelings. Now, he just observes. And this is disconcerting, because it shows that the artificial harmony was maintained by him, and when he stops, everything falls apart. Jung said that individuation requires confronting the truth. And the truth is that many of the empath's relationships only existed because they were absent from you. When they return home, inside themselves, many bonds are broken. Not out of malice, but because there was no connection, there was dependence. A dependence that disguised itself as intimacy, but that couldn't survive the absence of total availability. Eduardo, 41, was the quintessential good friend. He worked in communications, was intelligent, thoughtful, and generous. He was the one who paid the bar tab, who offered everyone a ride, who said yes even when he was exhausted. He was also the one who always had someone temporarily living on his couch, and that made him feel important. But over time, he began to notice that people disappeared when he needed them, that no one offered help with the same readiness, that his needs were met with silence or a change of subject. One day, after denying a favor to a colleague who had already abused his generosity several times, he heard, "Wow, I never thought you'd say no." And Eduardo calmly replied, "It's just that now I think of myself too." That too was what marked the change. It wasn't a break, it was an inclusion. For the first time, he was putting himself in the equation, and that was enough to reconfigure all his relationships. The empath, upon becoming conscious, doesn't isolate himself. He chooses himself. He learns to choose his battles. to identify the bonds that are worth his energy, to recognize when he's being used as support, not as a presence. And that changes everything, because now he no longer seeks to be loved for what he offers. He seeks to be respected for who he is. But this change comes at a price. The price of temporary loneliness, the price of being misunderstood, the price of having to explain that no, you're not angry, you're just tired. And now, you're dealing with your own tiredness. And this price, though high, is infinitely less than the cost of continuing to distance yourself from yourself. As the empath repositions themselves, they begin to experience something new: relief. The relief of not having to support everything. The relief of not having to fix what they didn't create. The relief of simply being, without performance, without obligation, without being responsible for everything and everyone. This is where true empathy is born. The kind that includes you. The kind that doesn't exclude your needs. The kind that doesn't demand sacrifice. Jung called this integration. When the shadow is acknowledged, it doesn't dominate. It cooperates. And the empath's shadow is their right to self-preservation, to rest, to not always be available, to be whole, not just useful. In the next part, we'll explore the impact of this new approach on relationships. What happens when the empath doesn't return? When they don't explain themselves? When they become a mirror and no longer a sponge? We'll discover what truly remains in the bonds you once believed were unconditional. Are you ready to see what survives? When you stop carrying other people's weight, there comes a moment in every empath's life when the silent transformation begins to become visible. Not visible to others, at least not immediately, visible to you. To the part of you that has always been ignored, postponed, pushed aside in the name of love, understanding, and presence. This moment doesn't arrive with background music, applause, or witnesses. It settles in as a strange sensation. Something inside you has changed, and even if you try, you can no longer pretend it hasn't. The change isn't declared, it's felt. You begin to perceive yourself differently in the same situations that once held you back. You no longer feel guilty for not responding immediately. You no longer feel that tightness in your chest at not being understood. You no longer tremble at the thought of disappointing someone. It's as if your emotional system has turned off the alarms that kept you constantly vigilant about other people's well-being. And in place of the alarm, silence emerges. A strong silence. Safe, almost sacred. It is in this silence that the empath's soul rebuilds itself. And this process is neither light nor clean. It is dense, chaotic, challenging. Because now you must relearn to live with yourself. Relearn to decide without seeking approval. To feel without translating, to exist without justifying. Carl Jung said that encountering the self requires breaking with the character you created to survive, and few characters are as applauded as that of the unconditional empath, as if breaking this role were emotional heresy. But how can you live trapped in something that demands your constant absence? How can you continue to be everyone's medicine when you yourself need healing? When you stop being the emotional support of others, what's left of you? These questions begin to echo in the new silence of your life, and at first they're frightening, because the answer doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes, it doesn't appear at all. Sometimes it needs to be felt in the body before being understood by the mind. It's at this stage that you realize that not everyone you called a friend, partner, or sibling was there for you. They were there for the version of you that served them. The one that said yes with a smile and solved problems without asking. The version that didn't impose limits, that welcomed without asking how much it hurt. When this version begins to disappear, the relationship disappears too. And that hurts. Because it shows that you were never loved the way you imagined. You were useful. You were functional. You were convenient. But you weren't loved. How many relationships did you sustain alone? How many conversations only existed because you pushed them? How many exchanges only happened because you accepted inequality? Questions like these cut like a razor, but they also liberate, because they allow you to see what you've never seen before. You were always the strongest link in the chain, strong enough to hold the entire structure together. But no one holds it together alone forever. One day, the body weakens, the heart tires, and the soul, The soul cries out for rest. It's at this point that many people around you start to get irritated by your change. They start saying you're distant, that you're strange, that you've lost your sensitivity. But what they really mean is, you're no longer comfortable, you're no longer easy. And this breaks the invisible pact that sustained the dynamic. Because now, to be with you, you have to be whole. You have to truly listen, you have to give, not just take. And this, for many, is unbearable. Have you ever wondered why some people disappear from your life when you stop being available all the time? What exactly did they come looking for in you? What did they leave behind when they left? The empath in the individuation phase begins to develop what Jung called the tension of opposites. The challenge of sustaining within oneself, the desire to be good with the need to preserve oneself, the desire to care with the right to rest, the impulse to understand with the courage to say, I'm not available for that right now. And this tension cannot be resolved with ready-made formulas. It requires presence, it requires awareness, it requires daily practice of internal listening. It's like relearning to walk. You stumble, sometimes you fall, sometimes you want to reply to that message right away. You want to please again, you want to be accepted. But now there's something different. An inner center has formed, something that pulls you back to yourself, a core of lucidity that wasn't there before. A space where your true identity resides, previously buried by 1,000 versions of yourself that were too good. It was during this process that Mariana, a 37-year-old social worker, realized that her entire career had been built on the idea of saving others. She worked with vulnerable families, welcoming them with firmness and kindness. She was praised. She was a role model. But she lived in emotional collapse. No time for her children, no love life, no quality sleep. And worst of all, she felt guilty every time she thought about herself. One day at a mental health training session, she heard something that shattered her. You can only care for another to the point where caring doesn't destroy you. It was like a switch flipped. She understood that her dedication, though generous, was tied to the belief that to be loved, she needed to be irreplaceable. So she began a process of rebuilding. She took a vacation for the first time in 10 years. She learned to delegate. She turned off her cell phone. She said, "Not today." And surprisingly, nothing fell apart. The world kept spinning, but she was finally breathing. Can you see how we learned to associate value with our usefulness? How we were taught that we only deserve love if we are a solution, a support, a foundation. How many times have you swallowed your own exhaustion to maintain the balance of someone who barely even noticed your true presence? The awakened empath begins to see these patterns, and once they do, they can no longer ignore them. The vision becomes uncomfortable, yet liberating. You begin to notice the subtleties, the tone of voice of someone who only seeks you out to vent, but never asks how you are, the lack of response to the kind messages you send, the meetings that only happen if you arrange them, the favors asked without a "how are you" beforehand. These details were once invisible. Now they leap out at you, and sometimes they hurt, because they deconstruct the narrative you yourself created about who these people were. But they also make room for something new, for true bonds, for relationships that breathe, that don't demand sacrifice as proof of love, that know that presence without reciprocity is imprisonment. The next phase is even more subtle. You begin to choose where to place your energy. You begin to protect your attention like someone protecting a child. You begin to understand that your time is sacred, and that giving it to someone who doesn't know how to care for it is a form of self-betrayal. This changes everything. It changes how you respond, how you surrender, how you love. Have you ever experienced loving without abandoning yourself? Loving without silence? Loving without having to break yourself into pieces to meet the other's needs? This form of love exists, but it only arises after silence, after separation, after reconstruction. It's at this stage that you begin to awaken something Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to unite opposites and generate something new. You're no longer just empathetic. You're empathetic and whole. You're no longer just a caregiver. You're both caregiver and cared for. You're no longer just the one who listens. You're also the one who is heard. This integration is rare, and when it happens, It transforms everything. You start to become dangerous, not because of the threat, but because you now know your worth. And those who know their own worth are free. They don't beg. They don't exhaust themselves. They don't sell themselves cheap. Your presence ceases to be currency. It becomes a choice. It becomes a gift. In the next section, we'll delve into the reactions that arise when you become this mirror, when your new stance no longer serves as a buffer for others. We'll explore the discomfort you generate when you no longer fulfill the role you were given. Because there's something the world fears more than the empath's absence, their conscious presence. Are you ready to see what happens? When the person who always puts out fires decides not to carry the bucket of water anymore? There's a phase in the empath's silent journey where they're no longer in crisis. But they don't feel completely at peace either. It's uncharted territory, where old pains no longer hurt as much as they used to, but still leave echoes. And at the same time, the new still has no defined form. This interval, this space between the old self and the new, is where the true work of integration takes place. Jung called this state the psychic threshold, a crossing where the soul begins to reorganize itself around its own truth, but is still tested by the remnants of old emotional habits. What's surprising about this phase isn't what changes within, but how the world reacts to it. When you stop living up to their usual expectations, people begin to project onto you the frustrations that were previously contained by your giving. When empaths stop being an emotional shield for others, they feel naked, exposed, as if their absence reveals the discomfort they've always avoided feeling. And this scares them more than any argument. Have you ever noticed how disconcerted some people are when you simply stop reacting? When you don't laugh at an offensive joke, don't automatically agree with a repetitive complaint, don't diffuse a conflict that clearly isn't yours? These reactions show that your role was never just to be there. It was to be the invisible balancer of the environment. Without you, imbalance appears. And for many, this is unbearable. That's when labels emerge. You're different. You're cold. You're distant. The world doesn't know how to handle change in someone who's always been available. People confuse emotional maturity with indifference, and they confuse self-knowledge with selfishness. But these misunderstandings reveal something even deeper. They never saw you as someone with needs, only as someone with a function. In 2022, a Stanford University study revealed that over 68% of people who identify as highly empathetic reported feeling guilty about setting clear boundaries. The number is even higher among care professionals such as psychologists, teachers, and social workers. The study also revealed that, when these people began prioritizing their mental health, they experienced a sharp drop in social approval. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. The world values empathy only as long as it doesn't interfere with the emotional consumption of others. And when the awakened empath begins to act based on their own criteria, this approval disappears. What was comforting to others becomes a threat, because now their presence no longer comes with the guarantee of free emotional service. Their listening has a timetable, their energy has direction, their affection has criteria, and this frustrates those who have grown accustomed to their absence. Claudio, 45, was the manager everyone adored, always smiling, always willing to listen to his team's personal problems, even during work hours. He bought coffee, remembered birthdays, and was called peace in the form of a human. But Claudio suffered from chronic anxiety. He slept poorly. He took 3 medications for headaches. He was constantly exhausted, but he couldn't say no. Until one day, after a panic attack in the company parking lot, he was taken to the emergency room. The diagnosis was straightforward: exhaustion due to excessive emotional stress. The doctor recommended immediate leave. While at home, Claudio began therapy. He discovered that his need to please stemmed from childhood, where being helpful was the only way to be noticed. When he returned to work, he began to change. He stopped responding to messages after hours. He began delegating, and he no longer smiled when he didn't want to. Within a few months, the comments began. "He's not himself anymore. You're arrogant." I think it's gone to his head. But what no one saw was that Claudio, for the first time, was healthy. The empath who awakens is no longer predictable, and the world fears the unpredictable. Because the unpredictable demands listening, It demands observation. It demands emotional responsibility. And not everyone is willing to practice this. Many prefer the comfort of the previous dynamic, even if it comes at the expense of the other person's emotional health. Have you ever noticed how some people only approach you when you're available, and then disappear at the first sign of autonomy? How many relationships have fallen apart when you simply started prioritizing yourself? It is at this point that the empath understands something fundamental. Their healing will not come from external acceptance, but from reconnecting with their own essence. They begin to realize that their sensitivity is a gift, but not a passport to emotional submission. That their empathy is a tool, not a sentence. And that loving another cannot continue to mean disappearing. Jung said that the process of individuation is solitary because it requires courage to break with everything that was familiar but dysfunctional. The empath, upon becoming whole, begins to disturb not by being aggressive, but by refusing to continue being permissive. They become a mirror, and mirrors reveal truths that not everyone wants to see. Laura, 31, was known for keeping the peace in the family. She mediated fights, calmed her parents, and covered for her siblings. She was the link of harmony, until the day she decided to stop attending lunches where she was treated as invisible while she resolved everyone else's conflicts. She politely communicated her decision via text message and remained silent. The family WhatsApp group exploded. Accusations, veiled insults, attempts to guilt trip her, but Laura stood firm. And that Sunday, while everyone tried to understand what got into her, she went to the park, sat alone with a book, and felt peace for the first time in years. The empath who becomes whole doesn't lose sensitivity. They simply redirect. They no longer pay attention out of obligation. They no longer sustain burdensome bonds. They no longer translate the unspoken words of others to maintain a pleasant atmosphere. Now, they let the silence speak. They let discomfort exist. And this, in a world addicted to avoiding discomfort, is a revolutionary act. But every revolution exacts a price. The empath loses connections. They lose social roles. They lose approval. But they gain something priceless: emotional integrity. The ability to look in the mirror and recognize themselves. To sleep peacefully. To feel that each yes was given willingly, and each no with responsibility. Can you imagine a life where your presence isn't conditioned by your usefulness? Where you can exist without having to justify yourself? Where your silence is as respected as your speech? Such a life is possible, but it only begins after you stop begging for belonging in places that only accept you as long as you're functional. It's at this point that something unexpected happens. Some people disappear, but others, new ones, begin to emerge. People who aren't frightened by your silence, who don't need saving, who know that relationships are two-way streets. And with these, you build something rare: reciprocity, a coexistence where your empathy isn't exploited, but valued. Recent studies show that people who learn to set clear emotional boundaries tend to form longer-lasting and healthier relationships. Not because they're less sensitive, but because they're more conscious. Conscious empathy attracts maturity, and it repels abuse. It filters, it protects, and most importantly, it reveals. Jung said that only when we face the shadow do we become truly free. The empath, by integrating their shadow, their limits, their righteous anger, their conscious absence, begins to experience this freedom. They stop seeking approval. They stop negotiating their peace. They stop being afraid of displeasing, because they understand that no bond is worth the price of self-abandonment. In the next part, we'll follow what happens when this empath begins to build a new world around him, a world where he no longer needs to hide. We'll observe how his silence doesn't push away, but rather selects, and how this new energy begins to attract what truly matters: presence, truth, and love without demands. Are you prepared to see what is born when someone who has always been shaped by everyone finally shapes himself? When the empath crosses the threshold of silence, of limits, and of disconnection from everything that consumed them, they don't return as someone broken, but as someone whole. Integrity, however, carries a consequence. It no longer adapts. And this is what begins to hurt those who were previously comfortable with their emotional malleability. Now, faced with their new posture, the masks begin to fall. Relationships previously sustained by their unilateral concessions slowly crumble, like foundationless structures. The empath no longer needs to shout. Their new presence, silent and firm, becomes a natural threat to the emotional games they were once part of. This phase brings a particular pain, no longer the pain of carrying others, but the pain of seeing those who never carried you. You begin to realize that what you called a bond was often dependence, that what seemed like affection was often habit, and that what was sold as love was actually control, disguised as affection. The awakened empath begins to be seen as unpredictable, because they now act out of conscience, not obligation. This emotional autonomy destabilizes structures that relied on your former fragility. And with that, you become a mirror. And the mirror is never to blame for the image it reflects, but is almost always held responsible for it. It is at this stage that loneliness presents itself again, but now in a new form, no longer as absence, but as a sorting process. Your loneliness is now a natural sorting process. It removes what was once a burden and begins to attract what vibrates at the same frequency. This is when the first mature, conscious, slow relationships emerge. Not perfect relationships, but whole relationships. With pauses, with listening, with real presence. You begin to feel that for the first time, you are being found by those who truly see you, and not just by those who consume you. But this doesn't happen without resistance. Many who once surrounded you begin to test your new boundaries. They return with small emotional manipulations. They try to instill guilt, remind you of what you always did, how much better you were before. They say they miss who you were, but this longing isn't for you. It's for the version of you that gave of yourself to the point of exhaustion. And upon realizing this, the empath is no longer moved, because now they understand that longing isn't always affection. Sometimes it's just longing for the usefulness you represented. Carl Jung said that what we deny in ourselves is projected onto others. And when you stop accepting being the field where others pour their shadows, you force everyone to look at themselves. Your presence ceases to be anesthetic. It becomes truth, and truth, when unwanted, becomes uncomfortable. The awakened empath carries this discomfort without needing to say a word. Your refusal, your silence, your strategic absence is enough for the discomfort to arise. And this is your new strength. You influence without touching. You transform without forcing. You heal without nullifying yourself. At this stage, many ask, am I being too harsh, too selfish, too cold? This doubt arises because the empath still remembers the old guilt. But the truth is, you're now practicing something rare: emotional responsibility for yourself. You no longer expect others to save you. You no longer place the burden of validating your existence on others. And because of this, you no longer submit to what diminishes you. This new stance isn't harsh, it's balance. And the world, unaccustomed to deep-rooted empathy, confuses balance with coldness. It is at this point that the empath begins to inhabit a new internal space, that of choice. They realize they no longer need to react. They can choose. They can observe, feel, reflect, and decide. This pause between stimulus and response is what Jung saw as a sign of individuation. The soul has ceased to be reactive and has become conscious. The empath now no longer needs to rush to save anyone. They offer help only when there is a genuine request, when there is genuine openness, when there is an exchange. And even then, they respect their own limits, because they know that giving beyond their means is not generosity. It is camouflaged self-destruction. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this phase is the rediscovery of one's own voice. The voice that, for years, was muffled by the needs of others. This voice begins timidly, insecurely, as if asking permission to exist. But soon it grows, gains tone, gains rhythm. And when it expresses itself, the world hears something unprecedented: the embarrassment saying no, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with peace. The mature, whole, serene no. The no that doesn't need a long explanation. The no that comes from the body, from the soul, from the certainty that it doesn't belong there. Have you ever tried saying no and not justifying it later? Have you noticed what happens when you simply walk away, without fanfare, from a place that doesn't honor you? This experience is transformative because it reveals how much you explained yourself to be accepted, and how now acceptance has ceased to be a priority. It is at this point that the empath encounters one of the most profound experiences of their journey: emotional freedom. A freedom that is not noisy. It is calm. It allows you to hear a cry for help and honestly assess whether you can respond. It allows you to love someone without having to lose yourself in that love. It allows you to be present without having to hurt yourself to prove your presence. This freedom redefines everything: your routine, your bonds, your commitments. Because now, everything passes through the sieve of inner truth. Nothing is automatic anymore. Jung said that healing comes from encountering the unconscious. And the empath, by ceasing to live on emotional autopilot, begins to heal generations of internalized pain. They begin to say yes to their life, no to repetition. They begin to write their story with their own hand, without fear of disappointing those who only knew how to love while they remained silent. This new writing is slow but steady. It's like retraining the heart. It still tries to run to old places. It's still moved by the tears of those who manipulated you. It still wavers. But now there's a center within you that pulls you back, that reminds you of the path, that sustains you. This center is your new home, a home where you don't have to mutilate yourself to fit in, where your joy matters as much as that of others, where you can rest, and when the world tries to make you return, and it will, you no longer fit there. Because now you've grown inside, you've grown inward. And the old emotional garment, the one that fit everyone, now tightens, suffocates you. You look at it with gratitude. It brought you this far, but now it's time to wear what truly represents you, something tailored to the soul you're becoming. In the next part, we'll follow how this empath begins to relate to the world from their new essence. We'll explore what happens when their presence is no longer an obligation, but a conscious choice, and how this choice transforms not only their relationships, but their very experience of existence. Are you ready to see what blossoms when what has always served as a bridge finally becomes destiny? The moment comes when the empath, having passed through every layer of silence, limit, deconstruction, and reconstruction, finds the rarest and most sacred place there is, the center. This center is not a glorious destination. There is no applause. There is no celebration. It is silent, discreet, almost imperceptible, but it is solid, safe, an internal point of balance where he no longer needs to prove himself, justify himself, or mold himself. Now he is. He simply is. The world around them remains the same, noisy, demanding, emotionally hungry. But something has changed, the way they approach this world. The awakened empath's presence no longer comes with a yearning to be needed. It comes with serenity. They no longer enter spaces to fix things. They enter to observe, to discern whether their presence there is a choice or merely repetition. The empath who has become whole no longer fights for belonging. They offer connection, but only where there is reciprocity. And that changes everything. This new posture isn't cold. It's centered. It's not distant, it's lucid. It's the lucidity of someone who spent their life being the fertile ground for the emotional growth of others, and now has decided to plant something within themselves. From this clarity, they begin to rebuild their bonds, their priorities, and their routine. But this time, not from need, from awareness. It's in this final stage that he realizes the pain had a purpose, that every hidden tear, every silent night, every moment of emotional exhaustion were not in vain. They served to open the necessary space for an authentic identity to blossom, an identity that doesn't depend on constant validation, nor on being everyone's favorite. Because now, he is his own home. Jung said that individuation is the process of becoming who one is, not what one expects, not what one projects, but what truly pulsates within. And the empath who has reached this point has gone through this process. He went from functional persona to real presence, from chronic pleaser to mature individual. And this transformation is simultaneously painful and liberating, because it requires loss, but it restores dignity. Now he begins to choose more carefully where to invest his energy. He no longer responds impulsively. He doesn't participate in conversations where he's diminished. He doesn't accept invitations that feel like emotional traps. He understands that his time is finite and that his affection is precious. From this, a new internal ethic emerges. No longer giving to be accepted, but giving because it makes sense, because there's value, because there's truth. From this point on, new practices emerge. Not theoretical, but concrete. The integrated empath begins to structure their life to support their new stance. They create spaces of silence in their routine, not as an escape, but as a way to reconnect. They set time limits for draining interactions. They organize their emotional schedule with the same seriousness they organize their professional schedule. And this isn't rigidity, it's self-respect. He begins to practice saying no without guilt. He withdraws from arguments that lead nowhere. He pauses before responding to emotional messages. He develops the habit of asking himself, does this expand or contract me? And, based on that question, he makes decisions. He stops living on emotional autopilot and begins to live from his center. And here comes the practical plan for you, who are listening or reading all this with your heart pounding. Perhaps you've seen yourself in many parts of this journey. Maybe you're at the beginning, the middle, or the end. It doesn't matter. What matters is knowing there is a path, and that it can start now. 1. Keep an emotional journal. It doesn't have to be long. Just write down at the end of each day how you felt in your most memorable interactions. Ask yourself, did I feel respected? Did I feel used? Did I feel at peace? This will help you identify patterns. 2. Choose an emotional limit to practice each week. This could mean only responding to messages at certain times, saying no to invitations that don't make sense, or simply not justifying every choice. Start small, but start. 3. Establish a weekly quiet time, a period where you're not available to the outside world. It could be a Sunday afternoon or an hour a day. Use this time to reconnect. No social media, no obligations, just you and yourself. 4. Practice strategic withdrawal. Observe which relationships nourish you and which only drain you. And allow yourself to retreat, even discreetly, from those who don't respect you. Remember, withdrawing is a way of saying, I care about myself. 5. Cultivate new connections based on your new truth. Start opening yourself up to people who don't demand emotional performance from you. People who know how to listen, who respect your time, who meet you where you are without trying to mold you. 6. Reread this entire script whenever you feel yourself slipping back into old patterns. Highlight the passages that resonate most with you. Record audio recordings for yourself. Create visual reminders. Make this an ongoing process. This is the journey. It's not linear. Sometimes you'll backtrack. You'll give in. You'll doubt. But that doesn't negate your progress. What matters is that now you know. There is a place within you where truth resides, and you have the right and the duty to live there. With each step along this path, you become less manipulable, less reactive, less consumable, and more whole, more lucid, more complete. With each respectful unspoken word, each firmly sustained silence, each choice made with a peaceful heart, you move closer to your essence. And that's the greatest gift you can give yourself, because no one else can do this work for you. No one can fill this space for you. The responsibility is yours, but so is the freedom, so is the beauty, so is the rebirth. Now I want to invite you to take action. Don't let this moment be just another piece of content you consume and forget. Grab a pen and paper. Write down an action you can take today. Something small, but real. Send a message you've been putting off. Say a no that's stuck in your throat. Create the space of silence you need. And if this video or text touched you in any way, subscribe now to the Deep Psyche channel. This helps spread this message to more people who need to break silent cycles of self-abandonment. Like the video, share it, and if it touches your heart, comment below about your experience. It can be anonymous, it can be a rant, it can be a question. We read everything, and we respond with the same care we take in writing this. You're not alone on this journey, and if you've made it this far, you've already taken the most important step. You've decided not to abandon yourself anymore. Now it's time to walk. Whole, present, conscious. See you on the other side of your new version.